Imagine growing up knowing that your only purpose in life is to take a beating. Not for something you did, but for something someone else did, and you cannot refuse. This was the reality for real children in history. It sounds madness, doesn't it? But it actually happened. For centuries, in European courts, there was an official position called the whipping boy. These children were chosen from a young age to live alongside princes, not as friends, not as normal servants, but as substitutes for punishment. When the prince behaved badly or failed in his lessons, this child was the one who got beaten. And today you are going to discover how this worked, why it existed, and the ultimate fate of these children. Let's go back in time. We are in medieval and Renaissance Europe, between the 15th and 18th centuries. In this era, people believed in something called the divine right of kings. What does that mean? Simple: kings and their families were considered chosen by God. They weren't normal people. They were sacred, untouchable. Now, think about it with me. You have a 7-year-old prince, a child like any other. He throws a tantrum. He doesn't want to study Latin. He throws food at his tutor. He refuses to learn mathematics. Normal child behavior, right? But here is the problem. How do you discipline this child if no one is allowed to touch him? Tutors couldn't hit him. Parents rarely punished physically. Striking a prince was considered sacrilege. It was literally hitting someone chosen by God. The consequences for anyone who dared could be terrible. But every educator of the time knew that children needed discipline. In fact, back then, physical punishment was considered an essential part of education. I'm not saying it was right. I'm saying that's how things were. So, a question arose that haunted the courts. How to educate a future king without being able to punish him? The solution they invented was both brilliant and cruel. If you cannot hit the prince, you hit someone else in front of him. But not just anyone. It had to be someone the prince cared about. Someone whose pain he would feel in some way. And thus, the position of the whipping boy was born. The choice of this child was not random. They didn't just grab any boy from the street. The process was careful and calculated. Usually, they chose the sons of lesser nobility. Families who had some status but could not refuse an honor offered by the court. For these families, it was an opportunity. Their son would live in the palace. He would be educated alongside the future king. He would have access to teachers, food, fine clothes, and most importantly, he would create a connection with the prince that could result in favors and important positions in the future. But the price was literal and painful. These children were brought to the palace very young, usually at 5 or 6 years of age. From that moment on, they lived a strange, double life. On one hand, they received the same education as the prince. They studied together, learned the same lessons. Latin, mathematics, history, riding, fencing, dance, etiquette. They ate at the same tables, slept in nearby rooms, played together. Think about what is going through this child's head. You are living a life of luxury. You are friends with the future king. But at the same time, you know that at any moment, if your friend does something wrong, you are going to get beaten. And we aren't talking about a slap on the wrist. We are talking about real whippings, with wooden rods, with belts, with whips, sometimes in front of the entire court. One of the best documented cases is that of Barnaby Fitzpatrick. He was the whipping boy for King Edward VI of England in the 16th century. Barnaby was the son of an Irish noble. He was brought to the English court when he was 7. For years, he and Edward studied side by side. Letters between them show they developed a genuine friendship. Edward called Barnaby my Fitzpatrick and trusted him. But the letters also reveal something darker. There are references to necessary punishments and corrections applied. Historians have found records of at least 15 documented occasions where Barnaby was whipped for Edward's mistakes. 15 recorded times. Imagine how many went unrecorded. In one letter, Edward writes something heartbreaking. He says he tries harder in his studies now because he doesn't want his friend to suffer. Do you see the psychological manipulation in that? The system worked not through the prince's physical pain, but through emotional guilt. The prince learned that his actions had consequences, but the consequences fell upon someone else. Another famous case is William Murray. He was the whipping boy for Charles I of England. William came from a Scottish family of low nobility. He and Charles grew up together from the age of 5. Their relationship was so close that when Charles became king, he made William the Earl of Dorset. He gave him lands, money, a powerful position at court, but William carried scars for the rest of his life. Not just the physical ones that marked his back, but the emotional ones. Documents from the time describe William as an extremely loyal person, but also deeply anxious. He had trouble saying no to the king. Even when he disagreed, even when he knew something was wrong, William supported Charles. Some historians argue that William was psychologically conditioned from childhood to absorb the consequences of Charles's actions, and this shaped his entire adult life. Now let's talk about how these punishments actually happened. Because it wasn't done in secret. It was an event. When the prince failed a lesson or behaved badly, the tutor made an announcement. The whipping boy was called, sometimes in the same classroom, sometimes in a special punishment room. The prince was forced to watch. This was the crucial part. It was useless if the prince didn't see it. He had to be there. He had to see every lash. He had to hear every cry. The theory was that this would create an association. The prince would learn that bad behavior results in pain. Not his pain, but pain he caused. Depending on the severity of the offense, the punishment varied. For small failures, like not paying attention in class, it could be 3 or 4 strokes on the hands. For major offenses, like directly disobeying a tutor or missing royal duties, it could be 10 or more lashes on the back or buttocks. There were unwritten rules about this. The whipping boy couldn't cry too much, or he looked weak. But he couldn't be too stoic either, or there would be no emotional impact on the prince. He was expected to show pain, but with dignity. Even in punishment, he represented the nobility in some way. And here is something many people don't know. The whipping boy couldn't accuse the prince, couldn't complain, couldn't express anger. To do so would be treason. Remember, we are talking about absolute monarchies. Any sign of disrespect to the prince could result in consequences far worse than a whipping. It could result in prison or even death for him and his family. So these children learned from an early age to swallow their anger, to accept, to smile, even, because that was the only way to survive and perhaps prosper in this sick system. But here is the twist nobody expected. In many cases, these children didn't just survive, they prospered in ways no one imagined. Remember, I said the system created an emotional connection between the prince and the whipping boy. That connection was more powerful than anyone planned. Because when you grow up with someone from the age of 5, when you share every meal, every lesson, every experience, when you go through puberty and adolescence side by side, you create a deep bond. And there was more. The prince knew something that tormented many of them. He knew that this child by his side suffered because of him. Not by their own choice, not for their own mistakes, but for his mistakes. This created a gigantic emotional debt. When these princes became kings, Many of them made a point of compensating their former whipping boys. And we aren't talking about small compensations. We are talking about transforming these people into some of the most powerful men in the kingdom. Barnaby Fitzpatrick, after Edward died young, was spared the political turmoil that destroyed many other nobles. Why? Because Edward had left specific instructions protecting Barnaby. He received lands in Ireland and a lifetime pension. William Murray became one of the richest men in England. Charles I trusted him more than his own brothers. William was consulted on state decisions. He had access to the king at any time. He slept in rooms connected to the royal quarters. When Charles was executed during the English Civil War, William risked his own life trying to save him. And even after, he protected Charles's children, maintaining loyalty to the end. There is a case in France that is even more impressive. A boy named Francois de Bassompierre was the whipping boy for King Henry IV when both were young. Francois was beaten countless times for Henry's antics, but when Henry became one of the most powerful kings of France, he made Francois a Marshal of France, one of the highest military positions possible. Francois commanded armies, negotiated treaties, lived in his own palaces. So, here is the cruel irony of this story. The whipping boy system was brutal and unjust. It was a form of institutionalized child abuse. But, for the families involved, it functioned as a macabre investment. You sacrificed your child's physical and emotional well-being during his childhood. But, if everything went right, if the prince became king, if the bond was strong enough, your son could become one of the most powerful men in the realm. It was a gambling game with children's lives. And noble families played this game knowingly. The practice of the whipping boy began to disappear in the late 18th century. Why? Several reasons. First, ideas about education began to change. Enlightenment philosophers like John Locke argued that physical punishment was not the best way to educate children, that there were better methods based on reason and reward. Second, monarchies began to lose absolute power. The idea of the divine right of kings was being questioned. Revolutions happened. If kings were no longer untouchable, why would princes be? And third, it simply started to seem too barbaric, even for an era that accepted many forms of cruelty. The image of a child being beaten for another's mistakes began to trouble consciences. The last documented case of an official whipping boy was in the late 1700s in England. After that, the position vanished. Princes began to be educated with different methods. They still had enormous privileges. They still received special treatment. But at least there wasn't another child getting beaten in their place anymore. Today, when we look back, the whipping boy seems unbelievable. It seems like something from a film or a dark fantasy book. But it happened. It was real. It was an official position in courts all over Europe for more than 300 years. What does this story teach us? Several things. First, it shows us the lengths societies will go to maintain power structures. The idea that princes couldn't be touched was so important that they invented an entire position to get around it. Second, it shows us how children have always been used as pieces in adult games. These children had no choice. They were born into families that made decisions for them. And third, it shows us the complexity of human nature. Because these relationships between princes and whipping boys weren't simple. They weren't just abuser and victim. They were real friendships formed in horrible circumstances. They were bonds of loyalty that lasted a lifetime, built on foundations of pain. Think of the scars these men carried, not just on their backs, but in their souls. Think of the princes who grew up knowing they caused pain to their closest friends. Think of the families who sent their sons to this voluntarily, hoping the suffering would turn into power one day. The story of the whipping boy is a reminder that the past was a very different place, with different values, with different priorities, and with a capacity to normalize cruelty that shocks us today. But it is also a reminder that we are not that distant from this past, that many of the structures we think are normal today might be seen as barbaric in the future. And the question remains, what practices of our current society will people look at with horror 200 or 300 years from now? What things do we normalize today that our descendants will find unbelievable? Because they certainly exist. They always exist. If you want to know more bizarre and real stories from the past, subscribe to the channel.